Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm Falguni from Champaka, and we are delighted to have today's book discussion with Lindsay Pereira and Jane Borges about Lindsay's new powerful novel, Super. We are an independent bookstore with two physical stores in Vasant Nagar and in Indira Nagar in Bangalore, with an online store that ships across the country. At Champaka, we are a community of readers and we curate our shelves with care. Our focus is on diversity and curiosity, and we hope that you discover something fresh and interesting each time you visit us. To speak a little about the book in discussion today, spanning Punjab and Canada, Super follows Sukhpreet Gill, who leaves Jalandhar after mortgaging his family's land for a chance at a better life, and Maynard Wilson, a struggling Canadian facing eviction and disillusionment. When their lives collide, the consequences are devastating. Tender, urgent, and deeply human, the novel examines immigration, identity, and the cost of pursuing dreams across borders. We are joined by the author. Lindsay Pereira was born and raised in Bombay. He studied at St. Xavier's College and the University of Mumbai and holds a PhD in literature for his work on gender attitudes implicit in 19th century Indian fiction. He was co-editor with the late Eunice D'Souza of Women's Voices, selections from 19th and early 20th century Indian writing in English. His first novel, Gods and Ends, was shortlisted for the 2021 JCB Prize for Literature and Tata Literature Life First Book Award for Fiction. His second novel, The Memoirs of Valmiki Rao, was longlisted for the 2024 Crossword Book Award for Fiction and won the Mumbai Literature Live Literary Award for Fiction Book of the Year. A collection of his short stories, Songs Our Bodies Sing, was published in 2025. Today, Lindsay will be in conversation with Jane Borges, who is an independent journalist, novelist, and oral historian. In 2022, she received the Reading Journalism Award. Her debut novel, Bombay Balchao, was shortlisted for the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar and the Ata Galata Bangalore Literature Festival Book Prize. She has also co-authored the non-fiction book Mafia Queens of Mumbai, Stories of Women from the Ganglands, a chapter of which was adapted into Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Bollywood film Gangubhai Kathiawadi. Borges leads Soboy Kar, an oral history archive documenting the lives of Catholics who migrated from the Konkan to South Mumbai. In early 2025, she was the visiting Charles Wallace Fellow at the University of Stirling, Scotland. Her second novel, Mog Asundi, releases this year. A very warm welcome to both of you. I invite you now, Jane, to jump into the conversation and take it forward.
Thank you so much, Falguni. And Champaka is one of my favorite stores in Bangalore. So I'm very happy to do this for Champaka and Lindsay, whose novel Super I really loved. Lindsay, I was, after reading the novel, I was obviously trying to find out a little more about it. And I read that the idea of this novel stemmed from a news report in Toronto about a rise in the number of young Indians who were dying. What did you discover when you began pursuing this story? And when did you feel that you had a book here?
I think it happened in 2018. There was a report about this place called the Lotus Funeral Home. They were responsible for the repatriation of bodies, primarily young Indians, and predominantly in the Punjab region. In 2018, they sent back 8 bodies. I read that by 2022, that number had risen to 33. And if you're a journalist for a fairly long period of time, it starts to feel like there's something there that isn't quite right. When you're sending back 33 bodies of young people and no one happens to say anything about it, it feels like there's a story. I started to look at this a little more. I looked at numbers, looked at the numbers of people coming into Canada. A lot of young people, predominantly from the Punjab. 39% of international students in Canada were all from India by the end of 2023, 2024. That number has now dropped drastically for multiple reasons. But around the time, I felt like there was a story that wasn't being told. it stemmed from these reports. I was looking at these numbers. I was looking at startling facts. There was a CBC documentary on young Indians, again, primarily from the Punjab, who moved to Canada for a better life. And apparently, the average Punjabi family has to work for 74 years to pay for 1 year of tuition. And I thought that number didn't make sense at all, because it's a lot. So I thought maybe the documentary filmmaker made a mistake. So I went, watched it again. It's on YouTube. And then looked at this place called the Naujawan Network, the Naujawan Support Network. It's run by Punjabi people for Punjabi people who moved to Canada. And they are the ones who came up with that figure. So it wasn't the documentary filmmaker. So that figure was accurate. So if you're allocating 74 years of your life to pay for 1 year of tuition, right? These really poor people coming in from rural parts of India, or affluent people who've sold off their lands and moving to Canada or the UK or whatever, simply because they have no other option left. You're putting your life on the line. You're putting the savings of your family on the line. And I can imagine why an inability to make that work can lead to devastating consequences. So it felt like there was a novel there because I had to humanize these really startling figures. And that's when I started writing.
You mentioned Punjab, Lindsay, and um, through the course of your research, were you able to understand why um, Canada was a big draw for the Punjabi community?
Well, part of it is historical. I mean, I think the largest number of people from the Punjab outside India reside in Canada, in Surrey, in Brampton. That's in British Columbia and Ontario. That helps. When it comes to family-related migration, it's called chain migration, where one person goes and they start to pull the other person behind. The US does that a lot with people from Hyderabad in Texas, for instance, or people from the Gujarati community in New Jersey. So chain migration is one of the big drivers for why a lot of people from this area then start to move in the footsteps of people who've gone before them. But apart from that, it also has, the historical ties to between the Canadians and the Punjabi community. They fought in the war with the Canadians. They've been around for 150 odd years here, so they have deep roots. What has changed is the number of young people who are moving, who don't come with that sort of support network. They're coming in they're hanging on by a thread. They're putting everything on the line, and that's when it starts to get really dangerous, because government policy has changed how people move. Earlier, a lot of people would move, study, get settled, find a job, and be able to put down roots. Right now, in 2014, the Canadian government introduced something called the Labor Market Impact Assessment Program. What they wanted to do is they wanted to change migration and allow people to come in based on shortages in the labor market. Within a very short period of time, that program started to be exploited, and it continues to be exploited even today by people who now sell that LMI paper to young students for a fee. Which means that if you are a young student, you want to continue staying in Canada after you've done a course in whatever, you can pay $30,000 to $40,000, get that paper saying that you are now part of a program that shows shortages in a space. In the food industry, for instance, you can say that I have an LMI pass for a food industry program, and it allows you to extend your stay. I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much the way that these, and this is extremely exploitative, because people sell everything. They want to stay back no matter what, because when you've already spent so much to get to a place, you have to keep doing it, because you can't go back with nothing, because your parents have put all of that money on the line. You have to stay back, and it's brutal. Young women are being exploited in all kinds of ways in exchange for an LMI program. Young men are being forced to work in fast food industries without pay, 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, and they're getting paid 50% of it because they can't show their salaries on paper, because they don't have access to a CRA number, which is tied to the income tax department, because they're not citizens, they're not registered, they're not permanent residents. It allows bad players to exploit this in multiple ways. And all of that played into the research I was doing for this novel. All of those figures are in my mind.
Speaking of research, I wanted to know what kind of research did a book like this entail? Were you speaking with young Indians, young Punjabis specifically living in Toronto? Were you also interacting with the local Canadians and what they thought about this huge wave of immigrants coming into Canada?
I spoke to a couple of people, but most of my research was on government policy. I looked at the numbers, I looked at news reports, press releases from the Canadian government over the past 10 years. I looked at a lot of news reports from the Punjab. What were they saying about people? There's a very different kind of rhetoric because in India, a lot of the information is about here's what you need to do to go to the US, to go to New Zealand, to go to Australia. That's very predominant. If you go to even NDTV today, I'm pretty sure there will be one story on here's what international students need to do to make sure they can get a seat in Australia or something like that. On the other side of the world, it's very different because it's about people who are desperately trying to stay. It's about protests. There are pockets of students protesting everywhere because governments are changing their rules and tightening. I think 74% of all student applications were rejected by the Australian government this year. That's a startling figure. A lot of these numbers, a lot of these news reports allowed me to think about what this means, and when it comes to what the Canadians think, all you have to do is go on to Reddit, go on to YouTube. The amount of anti-India sentiment that is now so prevalent, not just in the US or Canada or Australia, it's so staggering. It is so blatant. There's so much rage there that it's very easy to tap into. You don't have to do a lot of research. You just have to follow a couple of these accounts, and a lot of bots amplify it. There's a lot of anti-India sentiment. It's only been rising over the past year. Lots of people have been assaulted. 3 months after I completed the novel and sent it off to an agent, and we're looking for a publisher and stuff, a young Punjabi student working as a security guard was shot in Toronto. This year, on the 13th of March, a young Punjabi male was assaulted by 10 to 12 people. They ran him over with a car after beating him up. One day later, in another part of Canada, another young Punjabi man was shot by a drive-by. It was a drive-by shooting, so the person didn't even know him. All of these news reports exist. The fact that no one's talking about it continues to startle me, but the figures are there, the news reports are there. It's all a Google search away. These people exist. Their stories are there. They're dying. The 12 suicides a day in Canada, and no one's trying to figure out whether or not these suicides are related only to Indian students or they're just people who are killing themselves in general. So all of this stuff is out there. I think my research involved just immersing myself in these sort of dark, troubling news reports.
When writing fiction, Lindsay, writers often contend with the problem of how much research is too much, right? It's very different from when you're doing journalism because you know where exactly to fit your facts and your quotes. It's very different with fiction. How did you negotiate that?
It was a question of whether it adds to the story or not. I always struggle with do I say something that's of importance to me or am I doing justice to the story? With Super, one of the things I try and do is that I carry the weight of so much research when I'm creating these characters that even if it's a really short novel, it doesn't feel like a short novel. When you read 200 odd pages, you feel as if you've read a much longer novel because so much of what these people are talking about is informed by the research that I put into it. So the minute one of them talks about slumlords in Brampton, for instance, it's based on facts that come from the housing crisis, where 9 to 10 people live in a basement in some parts of Toronto for 300 to 400 a month because that's all these students can afford. Sometimes they die because if there's a fire or if someone's trapped, 9 or 10 of them die at a stretch. And then suddenly there's a flurry of reform. Oh, we need to crack down on this. There's no way of cracking down on this because you can't go into everyone's basement. So the minute you have X amount of research that goes into creating a novel, you have to choose whether or not there is a blatant way of putting that research forward, or there's a subtle way of talking about and just referencing some of those things. So I hint at the housing crisis. I hint at the exploitation of the gig economy. I hint at the amount of money that Sukhpreet's parents have put into his journey abroad. I hint at what the agent is saying when they talk about fraudulent documents. So all of that research goes into putting out these little hints. It just feels like a much longer novel when it's actually really short. But that's where the research comes in. Without that research, I think it wouldn't feel so, there wouldn't be that emotional heft that I try and give these characters.
In the novel, we see three lives of three different people intersect. So we have Sukhpreet Gill, Harneet, Maynard Wilson. And your book takes us through all these three different perspectives. Whose story did you most struggle with writing and why?
I struggled with all of them. Not being a young Punjabi boy got in the way, I think. I didn't have access to what young Punjabi men think. Writing about women is always really, really hard for me because they're very complex people, and men do not have access to how women think or feel, despite how well they think they can do it. I struggle all the time. How do I get women to women perform at multiple levels, right? Men are very basic creatures, so women are constantly performing at 3, 4, 5 levels all the time. Their bodies allow them to do that, their minds allow them to do that. When you're trying to create a female character, it's very important to not make them two-dimensional. And for me, as a male trying to do that, that becomes really hard. I have to give her need emotional intelligence. I have to make her feel like a real person. So when she talks about not wanting to immigrate, it has to feel real. So that was a big challenge. Writing about a Caucasian person as well is really hard. A brown Indian person. I cannot presume that this is what all Canadians think. I can only rely on information that I get from what they say in public. So I looked at a lot of their complaints. If you look at the Reddit Toronto community, for instance, and the kind of complaints that a lot of Caucasian people make, that allowed me to create the bare bones of what this person could look and sound like. So they were all challenging in different ways, but I think writing about women is always really hard for me.
In some ways, you've also humanized the character of Maynard Wilson, because we get a sense of where his angst comes from, this bitterness towards, Indians or immigrants in general. Was it a deliberate thing you did? Was it something that happened through the course of the writing that you realized that, yeah, in a way, you were giving us this through the backstory of Maynard? We also understand where it all comes from and why it happens. And there is I don't know if it's sympathy, but you do at some point feel empathetic.
One of the saddest things about growing older in India is how people I worked with ended up being completely different from who I thought they would be. A number of journalists, for instance, I don't want to take names, but people I worked with over a period of time, over the past 10 odd years, I found that they have been non-sympathetic, rabid bigots. And that has been a huge shock for me at a personal level. I feel as if the older I get, the less empathy I encounter with people I thought I knew. I no longer speak to a lot of my friends because I'm no longer aligned with the way they look at the world, the way they look at certain communities. I have problems with that, and I'm not afraid to cut ties because I feel as if I don't need people who have those kind of rabid uh, worldviews. And when it comes to Maynard Wilson, I realized that the only way of getting through to someone who is that bigoted is to try and find that empathy that they do not have for other people. The only way to get through is to try and it's easy to say that dialogue can fix this, but when the 92 riots happened in Bombay, and they set up these things called the Mohalla communities across Bombay because they wanted to build these bridges between Hindus and Muslims. There was dialogue that took people up to a point, but as we have seen over the past 10 to 15 odd years, that dialogue has failed. Not only because we've not been able to establish and maintain those lines of connection, but because the rhetoric is so polarized. The kind of propaganda that is now being shoved down everyone's throat is so rampant cross platforms, television, the internet, Instagram. All of this has made it much harder to reach out to people and try and understand their point of view. So Maynard was my attempt to try and understand where these people come from. I don't know if I managed to understand why he behaves in a certain way, but that was my way. And I had to humanize him, because to not humanize these people are like caricatures. When I meet people, even in India, they're two dimensional, because all they can do is talk about how they hate on someone else. There is no logic behind it. There is no willingness to engage. There is a black and white view of the world. But when you try and replicate that in fiction, the novel fails, because then your novel starts to look two dimensional. So you have to force yourself to try and make these people seem a little more human than they really are in real life. And if I were to sit with a bigot in real life, I would not be able to have an intelligent conversation at all. But when I'm trying to talk about that bigot in a novel, I have to try and humanize it. So it came more from service to the novel than from how I approach this in real life.
The title is interesting. Super. And you see two different meanings when you start reading the novel, and you understand where super comes from. But did the title come to you first, or it just happened through the course of writing this book?
I think it happened through the course of it, because as you pointed out, that it operates at two levels. It's a very personal word for him, probably because it's one of those few English words he likes using. But at the same time, it also references the role that he uses as a stepping stone to something better that eventually kills him. So there's a sadness and there's a lightness to it. And I wanted that duality. And it's a personal thing, because the reader will probably not feel the same things that I feel about it. But I felt that it was a title that had sweetness and light. There was something touching about how he uses the word with Harneet when they're out having dinner or whatever. And there's something very dark about how he realizes that super is short for superintendent. And he uses that thinking that this job is going to lead to better things, but it doesn't. So that's where it came from.
Uh, we were talking about governments and how policies have become, more and more inward looking, and there's this growing anti-immigrant sentiment. We know what was happening world over last year, and that continues to perpetuate into this year, actually. How has that really affected the immigrant dream? You've lived in Toronto. Can you tell me, according to you, what this immigrant dream is anyway? And does it feel more elusive now for the Indian population immigrating to, say, a country like Canada?
I think it has always been elusive, but a lot of it has to do not just with why someone's moving, but what they're moving with. When you move, a lot of people tend to be economic migrants, right? They're trying to be move to something that they think is better. They're trying to do it for more money. They do it with a sense of selflessness, because they have, at some level, I think, written off their lives. When I talk about immigrants who move, not just to Canada, for instance, a lot of laborers from Nepal, from North India, who moved to the Gulf states to work as laborers, a lot of people from the Philippines who move to work as maids in Singapore. All of these people they do it for economic reasons, because they believe that by writing off their lives and sacrificing their futures, they're creating a better life for people who come after them, their children or their families or whatever. The second part of that immigration dream comes from people who move as students, where they think that they're going to set down roots and they're going to have a better life, because their country doesn't offer them opportunities that they believe another country will. But that isn't true either, because you lose your sense of self. One of the things that happens almost instantly when you move as an immigrant is a loss of identity. And these are important lessons, the life lessons that can break you. But I think that if you are an artist or a writer or something, these things also help you understand yourself a little better. I know that happened to me. When there's a complete loss and erasure of identity and erasure of who you are, it helps in some way, because it allows you to start from zero, and it breaks down all aspects of your personality and leaves you with something elemental. If you are moving as a millionaire, your immigrant experience is going to be very different. right? People who move to Dubai with a golden visa are going to have a very different immigrant experience from people who go there as a student. If you move to Canada with a large amount of money in your bank, you can move there, buy an apartment, settle in. Your immigrant experience is radically at odds with the experience of 98% of everyone else who's moving because they're struggling. So that's what I meant by what you move with also makes a huge difference. If you come with a significant bank balance, you have a huge cushion to land on. If you don't, it's a huge struggle that can make you, or in many cases, break you and lead to a loss of life because a lot of people cannot deal with that kind of sadness and isolation and even the weather. A lot of people who move to Canada, I think, fail to realize that large parts of Canada have winter for almost 7 months. If you cannot deal with darkness and cold for 7 months, the impact psychologically as well as physically is devastating. My mother can never live. She can't step out, because there are lots of fears. You slip, you break a bone, you break your hip, break your shin. These are real consequences. So again, being insulated from that reality of living in another country, living with the weather, the climate of another country, it depends on how insulated you are economically. So those things play a factor as well.
Your first two novels were set in Mumbai, Bombay, a city you grew up in and you continue to write about as well in your opinion pieces, say for the Midday, where we both worked. This one is set in Toronto and Jalandhar. What did it mean to completely move and shift the setting of your novel? Did that pose a challenge for you as a writer? Because you were moving from something familiar, something that you had done in your writing, to something new. How important did the shift of place play in the way you wrote this book?
It was a huge shift and something I wanted to do. When I write about Bombay, I think I write in a very different way because it comes from a place of comfort. Because I know intimately, I know that the place, I know how it feels, I know what the air is like in Bombay, I can talk about it. But when I'm forced to write about something I know nothing about, I've never visited the Punjab, it's very hard for me to, there has to be a leap, and that leap challenges me. So I wanted to, the novel is for me, it's an exploration of intent, the intent that drives these people, whether it's the Caucasian man or the young Punjabi boy trying to move for a better life. I wanted to focus on what it means to have these ideas that you will change your life on your own, when you really have no agency or control over external factors that can devastate you. That's what I wanted to focus on. It happened to be set in Punjab simply because the numbers told me that if I wanted to make this an authentic story, I had to place it there. If I were to set this novel in Bombay and say Bombay to Toronto, for instance, it would have been much easier for me because I know both places quite well. But it will not be authentic for me because a Bombayite is not going to behave in a certain way as compared to someone from rural India whose parents have put their farmland on mortgage their farmlands to send their son or daughter abroad. It would be a very different story. So I had to go with the numbers, and that was a challenge, but it was an important challenge because that's where the story was.
I wanted to veer the conversation a bit into craft. And it's something I feel readers will always be interested in when you speak with writers. And I'm interested in knowing when, you've written 3 novels so far, and a collection of short stories. I'm curious to know what kind of processes went behind the writing of each of your novels, and how does it work? How do you begin, and how much time do you spend working on every novel? And when do you stop? When do you feel that you're ready with something?
I lose a lot of sleep over this for different reasons. When it came to gods and ends, one of the things that kept me up at night was dialect. I had to work on language a lot. I knew the story. I knew what I wanted to say. I struggled with how to say it. So that was a big challenge for me. I realized that if I don't get dialect right, the story is going to come across as inauthentic. My mother hated that novel, and one of the reasons why I feel that that novel worked is because she hated it. Because if it hadn't to connect with her and tap into something very elemental, I think that novel would have failed. So when she said that she hated it and she didn't want to talk to me about it, and she didn't speak to me for a while, but now we're okay. I think that's when I realized that the novel was doing what it wanted to do. So that difficult part was bringing in authenticity, because it was a community I knew quite well, quite intimately, a place I knew quite well. I was born there, So that was a challenge of its own. When you write about places that you think you know really well, it creates its own set of challenges. With the memoirs of Valmiki Rao, the big challenge was I'm working with an epic that everyone knows, right? And I'm trying to replicate this epic, and I'm setting it in two chawls. How do I do this without making it an absolute cliche? How do I do this without tipping over into caricature? When the escape of Ram from Lanka, if I'm trying to do that, I didn't sleep for nights because I just couldn't find an analogy that would work. I couldn't figure out how to say this without making this seem like a comic novel. And it had to be, and I probably failed, I probably failed with that novel. Not that I have any problems with it. I wouldn't change anything. But I know that the big challenge there was to try and take an epic that everyone knows and still make it new without seeming like it was completely forced onto something else. When you try and do a rewrite, you have to try and make sure it's a little seamless. So it doesn't seem like you're force fitting someone else's story onto your own. So that was its own challenge. The short stories were challenging because I set myself this task. Each of those stories is a song title, actually, even though I never say it anywhere in the book. But each of those titles is a song, and I wanted to try and see if I could evoke a particular emotion with not just with the song, but with what each of these stories was saying about identity, about immigration, about the way human beings react with other communities. Those were the feelings that I was trying to experiment with, and I'd never written a short story before, so I wanted to see if I could do it. So that was challenging in its own way. So to the short answer to your question was, I think each of these novels comes with its own challenges, and the craft is how you look at craft depends on the story you're trying to tell. The nature of the story, the form, each of them brings its own, for me, has brought its own challenges. Sometimes I've managed to do it quite easily with Gods and Ends because I had that story in my head for so long. But sometimes, like with Valmiki Rao, it has been really quite painful. I've really struggled quite a bit with it.
How important do you think rewriting is for a writer?
That depends on how confident you are with the story you've told, I think. Sometimes I tend to rewrite a lot because I'm not satisfied. But the minute I feel I'm satisfied, I stop. But I sit with it for a while. I sit with it for maybe a month or two. Sometimes I sit with it for 6 months and go back to it. There's this novella I wrote, and I've now written it 4 times, I think. So I've gone back and forth, and I don't know. It may never be published. No one may want to publish it because it's a bit, you have to find a publisher. Someone has to be interested. It's not a given that you write something and people are waiting with open arms saying, we really want to publish everything you've written. So with that, I've written it 3 or 4 times now. I've written it as 100,000 word thing. It's become a novella now because I've cut it down to such an extent. It wasn't a novel. It started out as a novel. So I think when you are satisfied with whether it's telling the story that you set out to tell, is when you decide to stop rewriting.
Last two questions, Lindsay. One is, you've been a journalist and editor yourself, and has that influenced your fiction writing in any way?
I think it influenced the rigor, not the writing itself, but the rigor you bring to it. You do a lot of you take editing very seriously. You take research very seriously. I think that has had an impact because you don't publish a story without, some people do, but the ones who are good at their job or take their job seriously are not going to let a story go without getting their facts right, without getting their doing their homework. And I find increasingly that a lot of people who are now, because a lot of people using AI to publish news stories, and they're not really concerned about, you have the same version of the name of a culprit spelled 7 different ways in 4 or 5 newspapers, right? These things start to have an impact when you're creating fiction because you have to have consistency. And I think that being a good journalist is about consistency, doing the research, putting in the hours to make sure that you have your facts in order. So it has definitely had an impact on that front. I don't know about the writing itself because I write very differently when I'm writing it as a journalist. I write a column that's very different from anything I do as a as a novelist or whatever. I've written that column for 11, 12 years now, and I write very differently. It's a very different tone. So I don't think the writing seeps into this part of my life.
Looking back at your first novel, what has changed the most about you as a writer? Apart from the awards, the shortlists, and you still not being very comfortable about, talking about your books. But what has changed?
I don't think the shortlist or these are all incidental. It feels like a lottery because no one has any control over these things. You can get a panel of judges that are just not interested in anything you're doing, and that it doesn't really mean anything to me. But the path that has changed for me as a writer, I think I like to think that I'm more I spend a little more time trying to understand characters. So I'm a little more there's a lot more empathy that comes in because I'm much older now. I feel as if I were to write Gods and Ends in my 20s, it would be a very different novel simply because I'd be writing it for the wrong reasons. And that has made a huge difference. I no longer write because I never speak of myself as a writer. If I have a story to tell, I will tell it. If I don't have a story to tell, I will not write anything anymore. I'm very clear about that. I don't need to be a novelist. I don't need to be referred to as a writer. None of it means anything to me. The books are important. I am of no importance at all. I'm very clear about that as I get older, that I do not matter. And that has come only, I think, with spending time trying to figure out why I do this. If I was in my 20s, I think I'd be a very different person because then back then when I wanted to write, I was writing for the wrong reasons. Oh, I want to be a writer. I want to be introduced as Lindsay, the writer. That has gone away completely. I think after I hit 40 or whatever, I lost interest in all of that. No career, no identity, all of that went away. I like when I'm saying that, it sounds quite nice because I feel like a Zen monk, which is not true because I still struggle to pay bills and things like that. But that part has, I think, changed the way I look at writing and the way I look at approaching the idea of a novel. These things are more important, and that has changed.
Lovely. Thank you so much for the conversation, Lindsay. And for everyone else, Super is in bookstores. Please go and buy the book. It's an amazing read. And we are waiting and looking forward to more from you, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Jane. I appreciate it. I appreciate the questions, and I appreciate you taking the time to read the novel because you were one of the first people who read it and sent me a very kind note, and I'm very grateful.
Always welcome. Always welcome.
Thank you so much, Lindsay and Jane, for such a lovely conversation. We are really grateful for this collaboration. If you'd like to read Super and Bombay Balchao, you can find the link to buy both books in the description below. We ship all across India, so go ahead and get your copies at the earliest. Thank you once again, and see you next time.
Great.